Thank you for having me. Thank you, Stephen, for doggedly trying to get me for the last several years and inviting me again. The climate panel last night was really interesting. I don't know how many of you got to see it. It was, I learned so much and took so many notes. I'm still recovering, however, from those lima beans last night. I don't know if I'm the only one. Those were interesting. I am a writer. I'm a storyteller. I'm a truth seeker, like many of you. I'm a person who's invested in the bittersweet contradictions of beauty and pain in the world that we're living in today. I did not begin this book as an activist by any stretch. I didn't have an agenda. I managed with this book to piss off both the pro-GMO people and the anti-GMO people because I walked a middle line and interviewed everybody on all sides. I love that Stephen mentioned how accessible my book is, and I think it is. I took 5.5 years to work on it. And the reason I took that time is because I'm also a mom, and I wanted to get it right. And there was a part of me that really resisted writing this book. When I first started it, I was assigned a piece by the New York Times Magazine about GMOs and GMO corn in particular, and the environmental impact of them, but also how laden they were with pesticides and the pesticidal action that is bred inside of them. And then the piece was going to have too long a time frame before it came out, so I ended up walking it over to Elle magazine, and that's where it came out as The Bad Seed, which became a viral sensation and put me on the hit list for pretty much all the henchmen from Big Ag. And from there, editors started calling me and asking me if I wanted to write a book. I was reluctant, and here's why. As I was doing the research, even for the 2.5 years before that piece came out in Elle, and before anyone asked me to write a book, I felt like I was sort of looking into this dark, dingy cupboard, and what was in there was our food system and the broken problems of our food system. And every time I would peer in there, I would slam the door and think, no, this is not for me. This is for, Michael Pollan, somebody who's got a staff. This is not for a mother living in Maine with 2 children and no money and no science background. So but there was something about it that continued to, the pink water bottle. You should all carry your own stainless steel water bottle. There's one thing you take home from this conference. But anyway, so I kept coming back to it because selfishly I wanted to learn more about what was happening with our environment and what was happening with our food. I wanted the information for myself and for my children, and there were just things that just weren't lining up that I would learn, and then I'd want to find out more, and I'd do another interview, and I'd discover that somebody was not really telling me the whole truth, or would say something that really sort of was incendiary, and then I'd want to learn more. So that's how I got on this whole track. But I love that Stephen said, to bring this back around, that it's an accessible book. For me, I had in my mind's eye a mom at the beach reading this book. She was my person. I had a very specific image of my reader. And she's got children who are coming in and out of the water, not so young they're going to drown, children, 10 years old or something. And she's putting sunblock on them and feeding them snacks and giving them water. But what I wanted her to be able to do was to pick my book back up and not have to get a PhD in the meantime. And that, like a Tom Clancy novel or something else, she could leave off in the middle of a sentence and then come back to it. And I'm told, anyway, that I succeeded, that the book is a page-turner, very easy to understand. It was the first mainstream, it came out in 2016, so over 2 years ago now. It was the first mainstream book about this topic. And And the book works very hard to be as mainstream as possible and to really break things down. So doing this book really turned me into an environmentalist. And how could it not? I felt like as I was doing the research, my heart broke for our children, for the voiceless birds, animals, plants, the soil, air, and water that we all need as I was working on it. I drove by myself across the Great Plains and interviewed Monsanto people and seed scientists and activists. And then I went to Europe and I hung out with beekeepers and I studied bees and honey. And I traveled with beekeepers around Germany. And then the last section of the book is about Oaxaca and how the native corn from our seed of agriculture, of corn agriculture, got contaminated with US grown corn. It was an exciting book to write. It was a real journey. I was often the only woman in the room, so I write about that a lot, being a woman and doing this. People didn't always treat me well. And at the same time, it was a real adventure, and it was very exciting to do. So what I thought I would do today, all that being said, is to take a second here, and I'd like to read you an essay that I wrote that I think encapsulates some of the issues I'm thinking about right now. And then we can come back to the book and talk about that. So let me pull that out. So this is an essay I wrote a year ago, and it's called Finding Garden Grace in Dark Times. The path from our house to the garden went through a small copse of trees, mostly fir and white pines as I remember it, and the ground was covered with their reddish-brown needles, soft and springy under my bare feet. Along the edges of the path, wintergreen grew, and I would squat to pluck the fragrant bitter leaves and the more subtly minty berries from the low plants, popping them into my mouth. My destination was my parents' garden, but the journey was ritualistic. Inside that little soft and fragrant enclave, I felt my soul, to borrow from Zora Neale Hurston, crawl out from its hiding place. Once in the garden, 2 big rectangular plots dug into the earth, I was surrounded by a veritable cornucopia. Depending on the time of year, I remember potatoes and squashes, cabbages and carrots, kale and corn. Not far from the garden, we raised chickens. Beyond those, we had red maples that we tapped every spring, hauling the sap to our sugar shack, where we boiled it down for syrup, our main sweet. We had a root cellar closer to the house, dug deep into the pungent clay-infused earth, where we stored everything that could make it through the winter. The outside of the cabbages, I remember, would become slimy, but their accordion flesh inside would remain fresh. By March, the carrots were shriveled at their points. Snakes and bugs hid in the grasses around the sides of the garden. Today, many years later, whenever I think of it, I see my father standing in that Eden, his jeans muddied in dry, round drying patches at the knees, and he's leaning on a shovel and talking to me, his brow sweaty, while all around him plants flourish. Back then, this scene was not only emblematic of purity, it was the literal embodiment of it. This is what my parents had sought, after all, a refuge from the politics of the Vietnam War and all the trappings of an American culture that was, in their view, destructive to themselves, to their children, to other countries. The way they tell it, my mother wanted to move to Canada, but they ran out of steam in Maine. It seemed far enough. They were romanced by the beauty and majesty of our coast, so they stopped and bought 60 acres with a small timber house on the coast for $7,000. There they began making a life for themselves and my brother Aaron and me, and there they started their careers as artists while learning how, over time, to connect to the land. I believe I can say with confidence that my parents weren't thinking about lead in the soil, or acid rain, or PCBs, or pesticides, or water purity, or climate change, or any need for raised beds. The gardens were far enough from the house that they could not be contaminated by lead paint chips, even if they had been thinking of this in 1970. These things didn't seem to directly affect us on our little patch of pristine earth far away from industry. Though they had both read Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, which came out in 1962, almost a decade earlier, her work had only a distant resonance with what they were intentionally growing and building. Those dangers, the ones that she wrote about, were like theoretical. What they were building wouldn't yet be touched by her truths. Also, by August of 1974, when I came along, the war was ending. The civil rights movement had made significant changes. Neil Armstrong had walked on the moon, and my mother was holding me in a hospital bed while watching Nixon decamp from the White House. And although Carson had died by then, after an heroic battle with breast cancer, the country seemed to be changing in her wake. Programs aimed at protecting the natural resources and future generations were being put into place. DDT had been banned, the EPA formed, the first Earth Day celebrated, the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act both signed into law. Our government appeared to be listening, in a refreshing and democratic way, to its people and scientists. Looking back, I don't think I'm wearing rose-colored glasses when I say that the time of my childhood was just plain simpler. We kids played soccer in the same sneakers we'd worn all day in school. Cleats were not something we even thought about needing. We had fewer toys and stuff in general. I played with sticks and rocks and shells and dressed our dog Fiona up in hats, putting lipstick on her mouth when I was bored. And I had one doll, and still have it to this day. My mother made my friend Jennifer and me a big box of art supplies, the Jennifer and Caitlin box, filled with leftover scraps of mat board from my father's studio and pens and paper to create anything we wanted. Picking the bad ones out of the beans my mother needed to soak for tomorrow's dinner was a fun activity. And back then, I don't think I'm overstating it to say that the incredible power of industry and its insatiable thirst to pillage from nature had not yet gotten into full swing. It had not come home to us. Stuff was not suffocating every square inch of our indoor and outdoor space. Plastic hadn't taken over. Today, some 30 years later, I think about that time and my heart aches. And not just because we left that Eden when I was 7, a pain that still travels with me, or because my parents eventually divorced, and later, when I thought our family couldn't unravel any further, it did. But also because the dangers my parents thought were distant from their pristine lives on our homestead in Maine are not at all theoretical anymore. They are real, everywhere. Back when Carson wrote Silent Spring, she informed us that there were 500 new chemicals being churned out every year just in America. Today, that number is more like 800. And as time goes on, there are now 85,000 plus chemicals in circulation, just in this country alone. 85,000 chemicals, to which, as Carson so presciently wrote, the bodies of men and animals are required somehow to adapt each year. Chemicals totally outside the limit of biologic experience. Many of these chemicals are carcinogens, endocrine disruptors, or have antibiotic qualities. They have been scientifically proven to cause anything from damage to our microbiomes, to learning disabilities, to fetal brain damage, to cancer. It's no stretch today to say that there is truly no pure place anywhere anymore. Not even somewhere we can pretend at purity. No refuge. Our soil, rain, air, and water, pretty much everywhere, are contaminated to some degree with dangerous toxins being pumped out by industry at an alarming rate. Even if we're miles and miles from the nearest farm, town, or neighbor spraying pesticides, the clouds will deliver them to our organic gardens in the rain. Bees will carry neonicotinoids from a nursery's potted bushes to our own squash blossoms. Every river now delivers toxins downstream. Chemicals come to us in baby toys, household goods, cars, and plastic shopping bags. Flame retardants from our couches and mattresses now show up in harbor seals and birds across the globe. Toxins come to our kids' dinner plates, both as systemic pesticides grown inside as well as sprayed onto our food. They come in our water leached through the ground from our neighbors' lawns and septic systems or in public water supplies. As a mother of small children, I don't think I'm understating it when I say this all feels just impossible, like an unending exercise in futility, a labor against a tide of not only chemical but also spiritual contamination. I say spiritual because the question that takes my breath away is, who lets this happen? Well, us. We let it happen. And then, of course, there are the many other problems that are affecting young families like mine. A shrinking middle class, the incredible and expanding costs of healthcare, homes, food, and everyday needs, the not-so-existential seeming threats of nuclear war, terrorism, the list goes on. Obviously, that house for $7,000 my parents bought on the coast of Maine with 60 acres of safe and thick woods surrounding it, I can't possibly do that for my own kids. And yet, here's the thing. There is still a deep desire so many of us have to practice attachment and unconditional parenting, healing the wounds of our own childhoods, while at the same time trying to give our kids something better. So many of us work hard to eat locally and organically and to try to cook good meals, some of us from scratch. All while working our jobs, cleaning our houses, and ferrying children to and from piano and baseball and dance classes too. Many of us are trying to keep our kids from falling into the distraction pit of technology. I submit that it is an act of courage each day to get up, put one foot in front of the other, towards something we believe in, to become a boat against the current. It takes everyday heroics to focus on making our children feel safe, even if keeping them completely safe is increasingly elusive. And yet we do it. And it is in this human desire to make the world beautiful, as Barbara Cooney's inspiring children's book character, Miss Rumphius, instructs, that a truly transcendent grace comes to all of us parents. And it is in this grace that I find myself on an early May morning planting our raised beds. Now look, I'm not a very good gardener. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit this, truth be told, given that I come from back to the Lander parents. But the thing is, you're good at the things you practice. For the past few years, though, inspired by having children and my desire to give them something of what I came from, I've been digging into the soil that I have. Together, my children's small legs tangled around mine, their hands helpfully poised with watering cans that are somehow watering more me than the garden. The seeds come out, and hope rises inside of us. To be honest, the mystery of soil and water and feeding the plants is, as of yet, still a bit murky to me. More often than not, I find myself with a packet of seeds in one hand, Barbara Damrosch's garden primer in the other, and my smallest child making mud cakes at my feet, while I try to figure out how to make a cucumber mound work better this year. A few years ago, my father joked that what we had was a demonstration garden for my two young sons, then 1 and 7. In many ways, he's still right. I can't tell you how many mornings I stand out there staring at the plants, my eyes squinted. Is that a weed, I wonder, or a flower? How did those lettuce seeds get over there? And where did the carrots go? But the reason I do it is that I want my kids to see food. Food for us, food for the bees and hummingbirds being grown. I want us to behold together what really does feel like a real miracle when the plants first come up, when it begins to take form, when a cucumber first juts off a twisty stalk. I want my kids to feel when they pick that cucumber, the warm sun deep in its green, prickly skin, and the satisfaction when they eat it of knowing that they grew that cucumber themselves with little more than some soil, water, and sun, and in our case, some luck thrown in. It has occurred to me lately, as I grasp for good news, that this may be our most powerful defense against the darkness. Because it is in this brave step that we take charge of our food, of the lessons we are handing our children about where food comes from. And we are showing them that change can truly begin at home. In this one gesture, we are saying goodbye to plastic packaging, to the corporations that grow our food, to the chemical companies peddling 90% of the seeds available to the world, to the water-hogging fields in Mexico and California, to the seeds available to an agricultural system that is dangerously changing our climate, to decidedly undemocratic system that makes a few people very rich and most everyone else impoverished in some important way. We all can do this demonstration, of course. Many of you already do it. As you know, we can do it in our home gardens, in window boxes, in pots on our steps. We can do it in community gardens. Our gestures may be small, and we might need a good dose of luck to make anything come to fruition, but what we are doing is still a real and tangible bulwark against an avalanche of information coming across the wires telling us that we are powerless, that we are no longer able to make a good, clean, safe place in the world for our children and grandchildren. Hope, as the saying goes, springs eternal. To my mind, there's nothing more hopeful than a seed in the dark, loamy soil. I hold on to that small kernel. Even on a day like today, when the temperature hovers below 10 degrees, I hold on to it against the darkness, against the fear, and against the pessimism. So, thank you. So that's a little essay that I wrote that is sort of more contemporaneous to some of the things I'm thinking about right now. This book, as I told you, was a big journey, a huge learning curve for me. I had to learn a lot of science. I spoke with a lot of scientists. I often studied some little piece of science, and then I felt I had to learn kind of everything around it. So I would read one study, and I would read 25 or 30 studies surrounding that study, so that I could understand more about all the sort of tangential and random things that it made me think of, say, or all the different issues associated with that study. And then I had to kind of crunch it all down and figure out what would be important for me to learn and what would be important for someone else to learn. So that was the real work of writing the book. And, to go to the topic that Stephen mentioned about as we modify the environment, we modify ourselves. That's a line from my book. That is absolutely true. We are dangerously contaminating our soil, air, water. Our clouds carry pesticides from one place to the other. It's almost impossible to get anything that's entirely clean. The part of the reason I wrote the section on honey was that I thought of honey as this pure and iconic substance, and then to discover that honey carried so many contaminants and what was facing bees and how many ways they were being affected was a real education for me. I learned a lot about bees. And of course, this kind of, the kind of industrial agriculture that we're involved in. Last night in the climate panel, there was a lot of discussion about raising beef and raising jungle to plant GMO soybeans in order to raise that beef so that everyone in America can have several hamburgers a day or a week. We often focus on the beef end of that, but not the plowing up of prairie or raising the forests or the jungle to grow those soybeans and that corn. Most of it's all coming from South America at this point, and because of global trade, those same soybeans are going to China or going to Italy or coming to the United States, and we're also growing some here, but we have used up a lot of our land in this country for growing this stuff. And we're volatilizing carbon from the soil, so there's a really important link between this kind of intensive agriculture and climate change, which also is not something that we talk about often enough or at all. Plus all of the chemical fertilizers, the petroleum-based fertilizers, the incredible amount of gas and waste oil that's used to produce one GMO crop. It's mind-boggling, not to mention the polluting of all the tractors and hovering trucks and everything else involved in growing that one crop.